Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy. I'm Tina Johnson, your host. Join me as we talk to the people on the front lines, the change makers and activists who are building a stronger, healthier democracy for all of us. Whether you're looking for expert advice, a new perspective, or just a little inspiration, this is where you'll find it. Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Jennifer Kamau, co-founder and executive director of International Women's Space in Berlin, Germany. In this episode, The Weaponization of Migration, we dive into a critical and urgent topic, the connection between migration and democracy in Europe. We explore how politicians turn migration into a political weapon, pitting communities against each other, scapegoating migrants for problems they did not cause, and using fear to cover up policies that simply don't work. We'll also dig into the real reasons people migrate, from neocolonialism and economic exploitation to climate change and war, issues that are too often left out of the conversation. And we ask the hard question, how can nations call themselves democratic while denying migrants basic rights, even as they rely on their labor? Let's get into it. Hey, Jennifer, thanks for joining me on Let's Talk Democracy today. I'm really happy to have you with me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I met you in Bonn, Germany in June. I was really impressed by the work that you were doing around women's rights, human rights, centered in migration, immigration. And I thought, I really think for this podcast, having this deeper dive into migration from a European perspective in the context of its democratic implications would be really a wonderful one to have with you because of your own personal experience and the work that you do. And so the question I'm going to ask you to start this off is, how do you see migration and democracy working together or working at odds with each other?
Thank you for this question. It's a very complex question because migration has been something that has happened for many. The world is shaped through migration. So there has been migration for very long. That's what makes the world. But in my perspective, the migration of people from the global majority coming to the more democratic country, I'm doing this with this context of Europe. So it is who migrates to where. And bringing back the context of migration is the same when the colonizers came to Africa. It was through the same routes. And the effects of what happened after the conquest, after colonization, and many things, also exploitation and war. Now, there is the other direction of people migrating from the global majority. And this impacts a lot in the context of democracy in these European countries, because then migration is put in the center of everything. And people don't see migration as a tool of reshaping democracy and how new voices add agency in the different perspectives that the migration brings, also including the civic renewal of the dynamics of people. But then democratically, it is used. It's a tool that is used. It is brought in the center of everything. Democracy, when we talk about democracy, you see the democracy, how a country is democratic by how it treats certain communities within their country. Then it amplifies the strength of a community, of a democratic country, in that context of Europe, or it also exposes the weaknesses of a country. Because how you treat people who are marginalized also it talks a lot about who these countries are. And the challenge is how democracy treats migrants, especially refugees, and how international laws and policies are changed dramatically to accommodate a democracy in a country with just one set of people who are used as a scapegoat for everything else except politicians being accountable.
Do you think that the fact that politicians use migration as a lightning rod fuels this inability or unawareness of people to understand the point that you just made, that, the global movement of people is not based solely on the fact that people just want to leave their countries, but because they're following resources, they're following opportunities, they're following family, they're moving because there's a need to move. And traditionally, Europeans, Americans in the US, Canada, have been able to freely move and to move to Africa, to move to Asia, to move to the Middle East, and to do and be who they wanted to be and do what they wanted to do while they were there. And now the tables have been turned, and there's this sense of, hey, no, 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 you can't come unless you have something that we can benefit from. If you're a skilled laborer, or if you're a scientist, or if we need someone to build our railroads, or so if you have something that we can extract from you, you're welcome. But if you don't, if we don't see it as valuable, then we won't have you. And then having that attitude politicized. Do you think that that role of the political narrative, the political, what's the right phrasing here? Manipulation of people's desire to migrate contributes to undermining democratic values and principles?
You said very well the freedom of movement, but then we have to question freedom of movement for which people, because it sounds like it's a democratic right, like you are free to move wherever. It's for which people? Because when you look at how embargoes have been put around for people moving from certain communities, then there's no freedom of movement for certain people. And the flowing of certain people, like you've said, Americans and Europeans can come to our countries whenever they please. Even when you see their framing of who they become when they enter our countries, they are either investors, tourists, expats. It's not the same as when other people come, even when they bring skilled labor, or what they come, whatever they do. You either fall in the category of a refugee or a migrant or a skilled labor, but it's nothing, it is derogatory. So there is also a power dynamic on who is moving where. But the problem is that politics have been put in the center. The politicians have used migration as a tool to spark emotion, because it sparks a lot of emotions. And these emotions are linked to identity. It has been weaponized. Migration now has been weaponized as a tool to bring to the center of every political discussion about everything else except being accountable as politicians. Because then it brings the issue of who belongs. And these identity issues dig deep, because when I talk about a context of Germany, and you mentioned very well, unless you're bringing a certain skill or labor, Germany also has a history of migration, because it had contract workers and guest workers who built this country after the Second World War, and even prior. It consistently wants to erase this history, because then you have first and second generation of migrant communities who are still wandering with a sense of belonging. So when the discourse of migration is brought, even those people who are first and second generation, even those who are born here, like the Afro-German community who are born here, they have no other place where they can call home, are put in that chaos of the migration politics. And this really touches and invokes a lot of emotions, because then who belongs? And all the blames are redirected towards migration by politicians, and we become the scapegoats of whatever is happening in these countries that are called democratic. And with that, people's democratic rights are taken away, because the minute they start questioning if certain people belong, even when they are first, second, third generations of descendants of that country, it affects people deeply. And why the politicians navigate towards this certain community It's especially when they have failed in delivering what they promised to do, be it housing, be it systemic problems. When they cannot address that because of different issues, I mean, there are a lot of things that we can talk about politicians, then automatically the migrant community becomes the center because they have people to blame. They have affected the culture. They cannot speak the language. They are living on our social welfare. They are everything except the truth. And this narrative is very well driven by also the social media, which perpetuates the narrative of migrant in a very negative way. And we are seeing it everywhere. We are seeing it everywhere, even when there are facts that cannot be disputed, especially when we can see that these countries rely on the labor from certain communities, so from the same migrants. When we see a decline in population and that there is a certain percentage of old people who need the care work, it's skilled labor. But even in the discussion, then it's very clear there's such a blanket discussion on migration that the rationality of even what they need as a country goes out of the window. And even in these processes, you can see the import of labor, cheap labor, because these countries live on the cheap labor of other communities, be it imported, be it exported, because then we have unfair trades. That's also exploitation from our countries. That everything, consumables, whatever is produced, brought in this country, someone is being exploited in our countries of origin. And people don't even talk about it, these cheap forms of cheap labor. Like our countries are made to exist, to work, to ensure that the global north is sustained. It is sustained by the cheap labor or cheap resources from our own country. So even when there should be a voice of reason on how they need the migration community, then the proper way of ensuring safety on these people that also they need, because then they say, we don't want refugees here. But do they discuss why refugees come here in the first place? When they manufacture wars in our country, when they sell weapons, when they exploit, when the issues of climate issues and all this carbon politics, people affected are people on the global majority. But when they migrate, then they become problematic. There's not one single time the discussions of migrants or refugees is made, especially the refugees, is discussed with refugees, with the refugees. It's always about the refugees. They want to find solutions about the refugees, and they do not want to include refugees and migrants in these dialogues. Then how will they find solutions if they always talk about people without people? So where is the democratic right of and the freedom of expression of the human rights of the people that have become a subject? And they have really become the polarization of the whole discourse of migration and the people involved. It becomes very chaotic. And this also, it also now makes it difficult to see the democracy people are talking about.
They use the term polarization, and I think that's the thing, right? Like polarizing a topic around migration and then using that as a tool to get people to vote for policies and politicians that say they're going to stop migration. They're going to address the migrant issue. And that's a global conversation, right? Donald Trump used that during his election against Haitians and Venezuelans in the US. And you hear that in Norway against pretty much anyone that's non-Norwegian by the conservative or far right party. There's really this focus on stopping migration. We don't need migrants. There's all of these reasons, even without irregular migration, for people or countries in Europe, the United States, to take in migrants, be welcoming to those people who can come in and do that thing that they need, which is to support their economics, right? Because that's a part of it. It's sort of, they polarize the topic of migration because they want to distract from their failed policies to address the systemic issues within their own societies. And at the same time saying, look over there, don't look over here. and then we want you to vote for things, they're going to diminish your ability as a citizen within this democratic process as you're allowing for the rights and opportunities of other people to be diminished, right? Like you don't diminish the rights of migrants without diminishing your own rights, because they're human rights, as you said. They're about human rights. And for most constitutional democracies, it's supposedly built into the way in which you go about organizing and supporting your citizenry with your laws and your principles of engagement. And for me, it's a question of how much of what we say we value in the democratic structure or framework of society is laid to the side when it comes to the financial benefit we receive as a country to exploit labor, to take advantage of the opportunity to use up other countries' resources. That seems to be another issue here as well at play. It's not just not wanting people to move, because in the capitalist system, I think it was Adam Smith who said you need people to be able to move about in order for there to be enough labor. And labor is the most expensive part of any industry. And the cheaper the labor, the higher the profits, right? The point is that people should be able to move because it's beneficial for the economics of industry. But that said, you have this idea or this problem, I would say it's a problem, where we say our democratic principles and values only are to be maintained and respected within our borders. But when we go out of our borders into countries and extract their resources, we don't own or have any responsibility for what we leave behind once we've taken what we wanted. And that's a driver for many people leaving their countries. It's war, it's extraction of resources. And is that a conversation that is part of the migration narrative from where you do your work? Is that something you're all talking about? Is that something that's coming up in the groups of people who oppose conservative migration laws?
Let me start by first responding to when you talk about the animosity that comes when, when certain people move, because it's about control on this migration. The fact that the global north cannot control migration, that makes them crazy, because it's about control, it's about the power. And this is where you see all the animosity of being out of control, because you cannot control migration. It has been there historically. It will not change. And whatever energies they put on creating boundaries, people will always devise ways of getting around that. And when people move, then the issue of human rights, global north, it has created a narrative of how progressive it is on human rights. But then the question of human rights, does someone cease being a human right because you're not white? And when certain people move, refugees and migrants move to these other countries, then their existence is tied around needs, the basic needs that you require in order to live. And these are human rights. And these needs are weaponized because then they're able to they want to control your thinking, your existence, and everything about you. So first of all, these needs are weaponized, and it becomes then it becomes like the existence of your needs. People don't see you beyond the needs that you have at the time. They don't see their responsibility in what has caused your displacement, because in most cases people are displaced, and that is a topic that is completely ignored. But within the circles that I am in, people move for resources. They want a better life, and they always have their people in mind whenever they leave. And I have not had any one person saying they are happy here. They just want resources and to go back. People love their countries. People love their countries of origin. this is very deep. Nobody wants to come here. Circumstances force you, be it for a better life, be it being displaced by situations that you become a refugee. But everybody I speak to within my community is saying, I want a better life for me and my family and my children. So, what is this better life? The better life is about addressing the root causes of why people leave their countries. If they would address the reasons why people leave their countries, I can assure you they would succeed in this migration politics, because not people don't want to leave. But when we say they address the reasons why people leave, will they stop the wars? Will the weapon industry stop? Are we going to address the issues of the effect of colonization and how it impacted people? Are they going to address the issues of neocolonization and capitalism? Are they going to address the issues of exploitation and taking resources from our countries up to date? We are asking them to address the root causes of why people leave the countries. Because if they want to solve this problem, then these are the things that they should address. But it is everything else except the why people leave the countries. And this is what we find problematic. And they invest heavily to make sure people are kept out of these borders, be it imaginary, be it physically, be it psychologically, because it's a very big investment industry whereby we have seen a lot of funding to the police, and for the externalization of borders. Here we have Frontex, and for me, I call them, it's a militia group, a terrorist group that is harming people and taking away human rights on these European borders. And if that kind of a group was set up in our own countries, you would have seen how much noise would have come with the issues on human rights. But the human rights issues they have violated, the crimes against humanity they have violated by keeping people out of these borders, because it is caused by themselves, then there is no word. You will not hear it in the media. You will not hear it anywhere.
The work that you do specifically is working with women who've migrated. And in that context of the why and getting to the sort of the crux of the drivers for why people migrate and what is not acknowledged by what they call the receiving country. In the context of womanness, what is that driver? Because it's a different driver. There's another layer of that as well. And I want you to speak to that and bring that into this conversation for me, because I look at it and it's migration. But I also know when I speak to women who are thinking of migrating or have migrated, there's a different driver. Sometimes it's for the family, it's resources, but sometimes it's also for their own safety for their lives.
I have seen a change in years, because before, like 13 years ago, in the context of refugees and migration, it was like a very small percentage of women who fled the countries, because then it seemed men had more resilience, or they were the breadwinners and they needed to go and get change livelihoods for their family. Or women were left behind because they had children to take care of, or women were left behind for certain reasons. But this has really changed. And this change of women also taking the risk and deciding to also cross these borders, it is a very bold move, because then in the whole context of migration, and to be specific, the issues of people on the run, refugees and asylum seekers, there comes very difficult situations what women go through. And this I'm going to point out on the gender-based violences and the persecutions that also come from the countries that we are coming from. Be it forced marriage, be it female genital mutilation, be it mass killing, be it whatever it is. And women decide, I am not going to put up with these cultures. I'm not going to put up with these religions. I'm not going to put up with whatever it is. And I'm going to find safety and whatever it is for myself. But the problem becomes then when the discussion of asylum seekers and everything else is discussed, And we have things like the factors that make women leave simply because they are women are not addressed. And these are countries that also boast of how much they protect women and children. But then when it comes to these women who are victims of gender-based violence, the same rights that are accorded to women who are in these very progressive countries are not the same rights. And in that, I have in mind something like the Istanbul Convention, which focuses on this protection of gender-based violence and the women's issues. But then it doesn't apply on the people on the move.
Can you talk a little bit about the Istanbul Convention, just for people who are unfamiliar with it?
It was a convention that was passed in Istanbul in 2015, and a country like Germany ratified. And it's just a short form for the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. Its main aim was to prevent violence against women and domestic violence, protect victims, prosecute perpetrators, promote policies to eliminate these violences. And Germany, for example, is a signatory to this Istanbul Convention. But when it comes to these particular victims, it becomes very hard for them to apply the Istanbul Convention. My work was one, to start amplifying these voices of women who are saying, hey, I am fleeing because of war and everything else and the climate justice, but there are also reasons why I'm affected just because I am a woman. And one of the things that we did, because the narrative of migration has so much been affected by mainstream media, was to do publications of testimonials of women from different parts of the country. What was the reason of why you left your country? Because there was always the thinking that maybe people don't know why people leave their countries. So we made publications with testimonials of women saying the reason why they were fleeing their country. And we ensured that this publication was in 3 different languages. The language the woman spoke, because the language is also a tool of oppression. We translated it into English and also translated it into German, because we wanted to expound on these issues on gender-based violences. And it was also a part of changing this narrative of fleeing. And this is a country that says how much progressive it is on women's rights, women and children. Then you start seeing the difference in these democracies, because these are also democracies. And you start questioning how these democracies and how these human rights are only applicable to certain human beings.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, because I think that flushes out this conversation. There is this continuous eroding of people's basic human rights to be able to fulfill their full potential to be full human beings. But not fully understanding why people migrate means that you really just think that they're coming to take stuff from you. There is a lot of aid, but there's not a lot of trade. There's no investment in developing countries so that they can be sustainable and use their own resources, and then to trade as equal partners in the free market so that they can be competitive. How do we break through this constant pushing and pushing out of this narrative by politicians that migration is bad and migrants therefore are bad, to get to a place where we do find solutions and opportunities to solve this problem? Because I don't think migration is a problem, because people should be able to move wherever they want to move. I believe that wholeheartedly. But how we talk about it is the problem. How we create opportunities, it's a problem. If you're a labor migrant, you might have a contract, but you don't have the same rights as the people that live in that country that you're working in. You have a lot of restrictions. If you get sick, you get sent back home. So there's these things that says we want something from you, but nothing, but we don't want you. That's problematic because it's not humane. It's insane. It's inconsistent with democratic values. It's inconsistent with the values of being human. And it's just something I struggle with, because this conversation of migration isn't one where people are taking something from us, but we're led to believe that. And that's creating this tension where we can't really talk about what are the real drivers and what are the real opportunities to solve for a greater problem, which is an inequitable distribution of resources and wealth.
Yeah, you just said inequitable distribution of resources. That's the problem. And it then comes again to why are people leaving the countries? Why? Can people address the why? And people are saying clearly, why are we leaving our countries? And you mentioned aid versus trade, which is a very big deficit that is part of the why. And it's also with this aid is a thing that I have seen this year, last year, young people, generation Gen Zs from Africa are beginning to stand against this aid and questioning IMF and World Bank with this credits that they're always giving countries and working with corrupt regimes. And of course, it is to still maintain the status quo. And that is the biggest problem. We want fair trade. We do not want aid because this aid is tied, it comes with very many strings attached. And when you look at always when the aid is being given, there is an agenda. There is never aid without an agenda. That is a very big problem. So again, we are coming to the why are people migrating? It's unfair trade. It is neocolonialism. It is exploitation of our resources. Also, the exploitation of our cheap labor. And now I'm going to give you a very good example. Because now there becomes a very big discourse on migration and how they want to deport people on one. The investment on Frontex and the European externalization of the European borders, there's a lot of funding. On the other hand, they have started a program, I'm specifically talking about Germany, that is trying to get skilled workers from our country. Now, the joke is that for one care person, an institution is using almost 10,000 euros. The process of the language, bringing the person, all this and bringing that person here. On the other hand, they have invested on deportations with Frontex and the externalization of borders. The question is the taxpayers seeing how their money is being laundered, because this is money laundering. When you start looking for skilled laborers and use so much money, and the same people who would be used as skilled laborers just to train them are still here and they're still investing on their deportation. So you try to look at that logic and it does not make sense. Instead of investing in externalization of European borders, why don't you educate the people who are here for the skills that they need? And they're saying here, I am here and I need to improve my life and I can do whatever it takes to exist in this community. They are willing. They have brought themselves here. They have escaped here. They want a livelihood. So you start an asylum process, and even the permission to work becomes something that you really have to fight for to get a permission to work. Yet, on the other hand, they are talking about not having enough labor. On the other hand, they are importing skilled laborers from our countries. Then you start to question what is wrong with politics. And it's upon the people who are paying taxes to start questioning how their taxes are being laundered, even into wars that they don't know where they are being fought.
Yeah, I think something that is definitely missing from the discourse is an honest explanation to the public. And I think the reason why taxpayers don't ask these questions, how is our money being spent, especially around this particular issue, is because it goes back to being distracted by we need to hate on migrants. We need them, but we need to also create this other as a negative because that's the thing that polarizes people enough that we can continue to maintain our power structure. And I think that is something that is intrinsically and inherently wrong in the way in which political narrative is allowed to shape the reality that isn't a reality. There are many skilled workers who have brought themselves through irregular channels to the shores of Europe and to North America. And you could invest in them. But if you invest in them, then you have to undo the lie that you told to get yourself in power. And so putting yourself or cornering yourself into this place where you cannot say, okay, we really need to tell you the truth. We need migrants. And yes, they've come irregularly. Yes, they haven't used the proper channels, but we need them and they're here and we should engage. You have people who are just sitting and rotting in these camps, because they're camps,
Mm.
and not being engaged. They're not going back, but they're there. So they're doing things to live. So you're almost creating this under the table economic structure because of an unwillingness to say, let's figure out a pathway to bring people into our society, because there's a benefit. There's a mutual benefit here. And I I think part of the solution from my perspective is, one, changing the narrative around migration. Another would be, for me, creating pathways that address the current migrant issue, those who are in the borders, and then those who would like to travel out of their countries for various reasons, that is filled with dignity. What are solutions from your perspective on how to address the issue of migration from its negative connotation that is put out there by political narrative to its reality, that migration is a way in which we increase our economic strength, that we address labor shortages, we address declining birth rates by bringing new people in to help us sustain ourselves?
I think the biggest problem is the mainstream media and politicians. They have hijacked this topic and made it a topic that creates a lot of emotional anxiety, which in the long run strains the civil society, because there are protests, civil unrest, because people are resisting. Because if you don't respect existence, then expect resistance. Because then that's when you see the civil society, there's a protest and civil unrest. And then from that, then politicians now are able to keep pointing, look, this is a problem. The divide and conquer between the civil society, the people migrating, and the politicians is real, because then the civil society is made to look at the migration as the problem. But the politicians are the problem. And the minute people start seeing politicians for who they are, because they are the problem, and people have honest dialogues, and I want to encourage people to have honest dialogues, because I'm part of this community, and I can tell you, nobody wants to leave their country. People being forced to leave their countries. And I have had people tell me, these people should just leave our countries alone. Leave our countries alone. Leave our countries alone. Don't militarize our countries. Stop exploiting our countries. Stop taking resources. Stop. But nobody is listening to the stop that people are talking about.
How do you change the narrative that's coming from the media? How do you change the narrative that's coming from the politicians? How does that build that power pushback to say, this is how we solve this, this is how we move forward? How do you break through that noise to get to the other side of saying, hey, you need to look at this for what it is, and this is the way we move forward?
People have formed resistances. Since I came, there has been resistance on this migration politics, asylum laws. And there was an evident change, because then the resistance was very strong. And up from about 2012, there was an uprise in a lot of grassroots-led organizations, which are leading the front on these resistances. And they're saying, okay, we're addressing different reasons. But then, and it's work. Activism is work, and people have to take it as work. But then there's such a big connection with funding institutions that speaking out, because of the activism and the advocacy and the agency for change. And people are very vocal on these agencies of change. But then you have to see how philanthropy is also being used, or part of it, in cutting the most vocal funding for the most vocal people. It's another way of working to silence these voices. And the people that are left, fighting and trying to resist become less and less. It's the silencing. It's the silencing, of which we have seen also during the Palestine, how the silencing, state silencing has become a very big tool everywhere. And people have to see beyond, people have to look at the world as globally and see whatever happens to this community will also happen to this community. But there are facts that are not going to change. The fact that demographically, there is a problem demographically, it kind of solves things automatically. Whether politicians want to shout out the biggest problems, there's an issue of demography that they cannot defy. There are issues like climate change that is affecting them, and it doesn't only affect certain people, it affects everybody. That is going to force people to have a conversation. There are people like we saw that during the time of COVID, that human rights became privileges. That even those human rights only privileged people got. People have to look at those kind of warnings and realize things are changing. Things are changing. It's becoming inevitable. Things are going to change. And even as much as the political narrative of how certain people are viewed is propagated and amplified by the media, there are realities that you're not going to defy. Nature is cruel. Nature is very cruel. And resistances have to be there. People have to resist. People have to think about the global change and the world agendas that are there. Because you hear people like Bill Gates and trying to take family planning measures in Kenya. Now he's launched an 8-year family planning measure. Of course, it's about controlling the population. But on this side, where the population is already very controlled, they're not doing anything to increase birth rate. They're helpless. So you see how violent they become when they lose control. So people have to be able to look for the truth. As I tell people to continue resisting in the small ways that we can. We have no option but to resist.
I appreciate that. I think this particular issue, because it's so emotional and because it's so entrenched in the way people see themselves, either being displaced, and this is air quotes, or not having enough because someone else is going to take their part of the pie, that it makes it really challenging to actually to see through it, because the narrative actually fits into your own sense of fear. And the work that you do, as we're talking about it, and I'm talking about democracy and bringing all these things in, but the work that you do is emotional as well, right? Like, it's a fight that you're in, trying to have this discussion in a place that's saying, we don't really want to have this conversation the way you want to have this conversation. We don't want to talk about the why. We want to talk about the what. And the what is, we want you guys to get the hell out of here, right? Like, that's the conversation. That's the starting point. What do we need to do to get you to leave? Not why are you here and how can we help? Like, that's a different conversation. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I know that the work that you do is this really big, heavy lift. It's a heavy lift because it's not just your migration story. It's the migration story of the women that you've interviewed. It's about the communities that you're engaged in globally around this issue, and the pain that exists, and the fact that when people get to the place of opportunity, it doesn't necessarily turn out to be that for them. It becomes more harsh than I think that they've imagined. And I just want to acknowledge that, because it's democracy and principles and values, but the ship that we're using to have this conversation around migration is less about the values and the principles that we say are important to having a full functioning society. It's more, how do we use our system to tell other people that they don't have the right to similar, if not the same, opportunities that we hold dear. So I just wanted to say that to you. And I really appreciate the work that you do. And I want to ask you this question because it just came to me. What is your personal hope?
I think hope, because there are two emotions that are used to either drive things in the negative, because fear is also an emotion that is really used to propagate. Even the right wing populism is about fear. And I hope to see a world where it is just. And I have not talked about racism. I just said a just world, because that's the bare minimum you can hope for.
Hope. Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciated having this conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you're also doing, because it's also a part of resistance and bringing the conversations to the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a wrap on my conversation with Jennifer Kamau. A big thank you to her for sharing her insights and for the incredible work she's leading at International Women's Space. Here are a few takeaways I hope stick with you. Migration is too often used as a political weapon, scapegoating people instead of solving real problems. We also need to remember the deeper reasons people migrate, from neocolonialism and economic exploitation to climate change and war. And we can't ignore the contradiction of so-called democracies that deny migrants basic rights while depending on their labor. This conversation is more than reflection. It's a call to action. So let's keep questioning the narratives we're told and work toward a democracy that's truly inclusive and just. If you'd like this episode, share it, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe. You can leave a comment, ask a question, or send me an email to tina@patternchangslab.com. Talk to you soon.